Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take complex topics and, well, we try to make them clear.
That's the plan.
And today, one of you asked us to really get into Trump's tariffs. It's something people hear a lot about, but it gets confusing, right?
Oh, definitely. What are they? Why do they happen? How do they even work? And then the bigger picture, the global impact, especially maybe for Asia, including Indonesia.
Yeah, it's a lot. So we've dug into quite a few sources. We've got news articles, The Economist, BBC.
Right. And analysis from places like Bloomberg, CNBC, even some YouTube channels like Clear Value Tax for the practical side, plus the official White House take and some academic viewpoints from the University of Queensland.
So our mission today is basically to lay it all out. What these tariffs are, the thinking behind them, how they're actually calculated, and crucially, the potential ripple effects, globally and in Asia.
Let's do it.
Okay, first things first. Let's get down to basics. What is a tariff exactly?
Simplest terms, it's just a tax. A tax that gets put on goods when they're imported from another country.
Okay, like an example.
Sure. Think about, say, a Toyota Camry. Maybe it costs $30,000 to import into the U.S. If there's a 10% tariff.
That's an extra $3,000.
Exactly. So the importer, the company bringing the car in, initially have to pay $33,000.
Right. Now, who actually pays that $3,000? Because you often hear it said that the foreign country pays the tariff.
Yeah, that's a really common idea, and it's something former President Trump himself often stated. But economically speaking, that's not quite how it works.
How does it work then?
The U.S. company that's actually importing the goods could be a big retailer like Walmart, could be a car dealership. They're the ones who physically pay the tax to the U.S. government.
Okay.
But, and this is the key part, that cost doesn't usually just stop there. Very often, that extra cost gets passed along.
To us.
The consumers, pretty much, through higher prices on whatever that imported product is.
So a tax on imports could actually mean things like clothes, phones, cars just get more expensive for everybody here.
That's often the direct result, yeah. So, okay, why? Why put these tariffs in place? What was the motivation?
Well, from my reading, Trump had this long-held view, didn't he? That tariffs were, I think he called them beautiful, and could even save our country.
He did use that kind of language. A big part of it seemed to be tackling the U.S. trade deficit. That was a major focus.
Can you quickly explain what a trade deficit is?
Sure. It just means a country is importing more stuff, goods and services, than it's exporting. So if the U.S. buys more from China than it sells to China, you've got a trade deficit with China.
And the goal was to shrink that gap, because the view was the U.S. was getting a raw deal.
Exactly. There was definitely strong rhetoric about other countries cheating or pillaging the U.S. through unfair trade practices. That was a constant theme.
Right. And wasn't there another angle, too? Something about national security?
Yes, absolutely. The White House fact sheet back in February 2025 framed tariffs on places like Canada, Mexico, China, partly as a tool.
A tool for what?
To address what they called a national emergency. Things like illegal immigration and the flow of drugs like fentanyl. The idea was tariffs gave the U.S. leverage to make those countries stop those flows.
So it wasn't purely about economics from their perspective. It tied into these other major concerns.
That was definitely part of the official justification. And then there's the goal of boosting American industry.
Making things here.
Right. Encourage people to buy American-made goods and also get foreign companies to actually build factories and create jobs in the U.S. This idea of redomiciling labor, bringing jobs back.
Because if imported goods get pricier thanks to tariffs, maybe the American-made option looks better. Or maybe foreign companies just decide to build here to avoid the tax.
That's the logic, yes. And Trump seemed pretty convinced that, despite warnings from economists about potential downsides, these tariffs would ultimately be a net positive for the U.S. economy.
Okay, so that's the what and the why. Now, the how. How were these things actually calculated and applied? It wasn't just one flat rate for everyone, was it?
No, not at all. There was this announcement, April 2025, about a sort of baseline 10% tariff on goods from most countries. But it got way more complicated than that.
How so?
Well, specific countries got hit much harder, China especially. Early reports mentioned 54%, but the BBC later suggested when you added in older tariffs, some Chinese goods could face like 145%.
Wow, 145%, that's huge.
It is. Bloomberg also talked about an initial 50% rising to 54%, and Japan and South Korea weren't spared either. The University of Queensland pointed to tariffs of 24% and 25% respectively on them.
Were these numbers just picked out of thin air, or was there some kind of method? I think I read about a formula.
Yeah, there was apparently a formula the White House shared. According to BBC Verify, it was kind of complex.
Crimey.
Okay, basically, you take the U.S. goods trade deficit with a specific country, you divide that number by the total value of goods imported from that country. Then you take that result and divide it by 2 and round it.
Huh. Okay, so deficit divided by imports, then halved, then round up.
Pretty much. So using their China example, a goods deficit of, say, $295 billion divided by imports of $440 billion, then halved. That works out to around 0.335, round that up, and you get a 34% tariff using that method.
That's very specific. What did economists make of that formula?
Generally, not much. The consensus reported by the BBC and others was that it didn't really have a strong economic basis.
Why not?
Well, they argued it wasn't truly reciprocal. It didn't match the tariffs other countries were actually charging the U.S. It seemed designed purely to try and eliminate the U.S. goods trade deficit with each country, which economists point out can happen for lots of reasons beyond just unfair trade.
And it got even weirder, didn't it? Because the U.S. put tariffs on countries where there wasn't even a trade deficit, like the U.K.
Exactly. The U.K. faced a 10% tariff, which clearly doesn't fit that deficit-based formula. The BBC noted that deviation.
So it wasn't applied consistently.
It seems not. And remember, for most countries, these higher tariffs were paused for 90 days. China was the big exception. No pause for them.
What about neighbors Canada and Mexico?
They had initial tariffs around 25%, though Canadian energy was lower at 10%. There were some exemptions and delays mentioned too. Plus, don't forget the existing 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum were still there, and planned tariffs on cars and parts were also in the mix, even if some were paused.
Okay, it sounds like a real patchwork quilt of tariffs. Let's talk impacts. Starting here in the U.S., what were the expected consequences?
Well, the most immediate thing everyone expected was higher prices for consumers, inflation.
Right, because importers pay the tariff, then they pass it on.
Exactly. So everyday stuff, clothes, electronics, you name it, likely to get more expensive. Both The Economist and Clear Value Tax pointed this out quite clearly.
Makes sense. Which industries were expected to feel it the most?
Probably those really tied into global trade. Think electronics, energy, food processing, transportation, machinery, anything that relies heavily on imported parts or components. Manufacturing that uses global value chains. The Economist listed quite a few.
And beyond specific industries, what about the overall economy? Tariffs create uncertainty, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Big time. Businesses hate uncertainty. It makes them hesitant to, invest in new equipment or hire more people. They kind of adopt a wait-and-see attitude.
And then there's the whole retaliation risk.
Huge risk. Other countries don't just sit back and take it. They often hit back with their own tariffs on U.S. goods. That can lead to trade wars, mess up supply chains even more, and just generally make investors nervous. Bloomberg and The Economist both warned about that.
But the goal was to help U.S. manufacturing, right? Did people think that would actually happen?
That was definitely the stated aim. But, as the University of Queensland analysis noted, bringing manufacturing back is, well, it's a slow, complicated process. Supply chains are so globally tangled now. Even if you assemble something here, lots of the parts might still be imported and face those tariffs.
One last thing on the U.S. side, government revenue. Did these tariffs bring in a lot of money for the Treasury?
Clear Value Tax did estimate that, a 10% tariff across the board could mean hundreds of billions in new tax revenue each year, which sounds like a lot. But probably not enough to make a huge dent in the national debt or replace other major taxes. That was their assessment.
Okay, so potential downsides for the U.S., higher prices, industry disruption, uncertainty, trade wars. Now, let's broaden the view. What about the rest of the world?
Globally, this was seen as a major challenge to the whole way international trade has worked for decades, based on lowering barriers. The University of Queensland really emphasized this potential reversal of globalization.
And the risk of slowing down the whole global economy.
Yeah, definitely. Higher trade costs, ongoing trade fights. It could lead to more inflation globally and slower growth. It's what economists sometimes call beggar thy neighbor policies, trying to help yourself possibly at the expense of others. CNBC touched on this.
Now, what about the U.S. dollar? It's so central to everything.
Good question. The analysis from Queensland suggested the dollar might actually strengthen because of all this. And if U.S. inflation picked up because of tariffs, the Federal Reserve might raise interest rates.
Which makes borrowing more expensive everywhere.
Exactly. That could put a damper on economic activity worldwide.
Okay, let's zoom in now, especially for our listener who asked about this, Asia. And specifically, maybe any hints about Indonesia? What was the impact there?
Well, Asia was definitely in the crosshairs. Some of the highest tariffs hit major players there. China, obviously, but also Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam. The University of Queensland listed those.
And Bloomberg mentioned Vietnam and Malaysia too, right? Places where companies had maybe shifted production from China to avoid earlier tariffs?
Precisely. Companies like Apple, for instance. So these new, broader tariffs were kind of catching up with those shifts, potentially hitting consumer electronics prices again.
So even if a country wasn't the main target initially, they could still get caught in the fallout.
Absolutely. Think about supply chains. Plus, many East and Southeast Asian countries buy a lot of raw materials and services from places like Australia. So if their economies slow down because of U.S. tariffs, it hits commodity exporters too.
And what about China maybe shifting its exports if the U.S. market shrinks for them?
That's another possibility. China might try to sell more goods into other markets, perhaps elsewhere in Asia, which could disrupt local industries there.
Okay, and Indonesia specifically, did the sources mention it directly?
No, none of the sources we looked at gave specific details on Indonesia, unfortunately, but
We can make some educated guesses.
we can infer. The impact would likely depend heavily on Indonesia's own trade links. How much does it export to the U.S.? How integrated is it into those Asian supply chains that are being affected? Those are the key questions. You need to look at Indonesia's main exports to the U.S. and its role in the region.
Got it. Finally, let's talk about the reactions. Politically, diplomatically, it sounds like these tariffs made quite a splash.
Oh, yeah. Sharp reactions from foreign leaders, as The Economist put it. Bloomberg said countries were ramping up their response.
Who specifically?
Well, Canada and Mexico were already dealing with some tariffs. Japan called it regrettable, but wanted talks. The EU warned they might hit back if talks failed, though they seemed open to dialogue initially.
And Japan questioned if this even fit within WTO rules.
They did raise that point, yes, about consistency with the World Trade Organization. And there was definitely a feeling, reported by Bloomberg, that April 2nd, 2025 marked the beginning of a trade war.
Were things tense even within the Trump administration over this?
Apparently so. BBC News highlighted some internal disagreements about the best way forward on trade policy. It wasn't a universally agreed path, even internally.
So lots of pushback, lots of concern globally.
For sure. And even with that 90-day pause for some countries and the possibility of negotiations, the underlying tensions didn't just disappear. The potential for more actions was still very much there.
Okay, let's try and wrap this deep dive up. So Trump's tariffs,
Yeah.
essentially taxes on imports. The stated goals were things like cutting the trade deficit, boosting U.S. manufacturing, addressing security issues.
Right. But the way they were calculated was pretty controversial among economists. And the risks seemed significant. Higher prices for consumers here, economic uncertainty, potential trade wars, and major disruption for global trade, especially hitting big partners in Asia.
It really underscores how interconnected everything is.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to remember the long-term effects. We're still figuring those out. It really depends on what happens next, politically and economically, here and around the world.
Which leads us to our final thought for you, our listener. Considering all these complexities, the potential downsides we've talked about, will these sweeping tariffs actually achieve what they set out to do? And, maybe more importantly, what will the true cost end up being for the U.S. and for the global economy in the years ahead? Something to think about.
Definitely food for thought.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.